Venezuela challenges the United States and calls the population to battle. Breaking news shows that Venezuela is calling thousands of civilians to the barracks. They're getting ready directly for an armed conflict. This isn't a movie script. It's real life, and it's happening right now in Venezuela, where Nicolas Maduro is ready to challenge the world's biggest superpower. And the reason? The growing tension with the United States, which sent a straight-up military armada to the Caribbean, right off the Venezuelan coast. Stick around till the end of this video because the situation is more serious than the newspapers are telling you. Relations between Venezuela and the United States were never exactly friendly, but what we're seeing now is an unprecedented escalation. In mid-August 2025, the Trump administration launched a massive military operation in the southern Caribbean, officially aimed at fighting Latin American drug cartels. But Venezuela sees this move totally differently, as a direct threat to its national sovereignty. Caracas's response was immediate and surprising. On September 12, 2025, President Nicolas Maduro made an announcement that grabbed the world's attention. He called on all Venezuelans who had enlisted voluntarily or were called up to report to the barracks over the weekend. The stated goal is simple and straight to the point: learn how to handle firearms and receive basic military training to defend the country. This isn't just a show of force. It's a mass mobilization that involves armed forces reservists, members of the so-called Bolivarian militia, and young people who just reached the age for mandatory enlistment. The message Maduro sent was clear: Venezuela is getting ready for the worst-case scenario, and it wants its people ready to respond if needed. During his speech on state television, Maduro didn't hold back when describing what he considers an imminent threat. He said all enlisted Venezuelans should head to the barracks immediately for what he called National Enlistment Day. The people to their barracks. Everyone who signed up, let's learn to shoot. Let's get ready to defend our homeland, the Venezuelan president declared. The call-up was aimed specifically at three main groups. First, the reservists of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces, who are ex-soldiers that finished mandatory service and now make up the active reserve. Second, the members of the Bolivarian National Militia, a volunteer civilian force that operates as a territorial defense parallel to the regular army. And third, young people who recently turned 18 and registered for mandatory military service. The training offered at the barracks included basic instructions on handling firearms, territorial defense tactics, and ideological indoctrination on what the Venezuelan government calls anti-imperialist resistance. According to information released by Venezuela's Ministry of Defense, thousands of people showed up at the barracks that weekend, although independent sources question those numbers and report that turnout was lower than the government claims. Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez gave a positive rundown of the training and used the moment to make an accusation that cranked tensions up even more. According to Pedrino, the United States tripled spy plane flights over Venezuelan territory or near its maritime borders in August. He said those flights, mostly by P-8 Poseidon aircraft, changed their pattern, going from mainly daytime to also happening at night and in the early morning, which would mean a ramp-up in American intelligence operations against Venezuela. To understand why Venezuela is reacting this way, we need to look at what the United States is doing in the Caribbean. And the American military buildup is honestly impressive. In August 2025, the Trump administration authorized sending a significant naval force to the southern Caribbean in international waters near the Venezuelan coast. The operation includes at least 3 guided missile destroyers, the USS Gravely, the USS Jason Dunham, and the USS Sampson. On top of that, the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group was sent, carrying roughly 4,500 sailors, along with the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit with another 2,200 troops. Altogether, we're talking about something like 6,000 to 7,000 American military personnel operating in the region at the same time. But doesn't stop there. Washington also moved the guided missile cruiser USS Lake Erie into the area, a ship capable of launching hundreds of cruise missiles. And maybe the most controversial element of this whole operation, the USS Newport News nuclear attack submarine. Nuclear-powered submarines are symbols of strategic military power, and their presence near any country is always read as a show of force and intimidation. Nicolas Maduro reacted with outrage to this display of power. In a televised speech at the start of September, he said 8 U.S. warships capable of firing 1,200 missiles were pointed directly at Venezuela, plus the nuclear submarine. It's an extravagant, unjustifiable, immoral, and absolutely criminal threat, Maduro declared, adding that he considers the U.S. operation a direct aggression against Venezuelan sovereignty. The United States, for its part, flatly denies any intention to attack Venezuela. Officially, Washington says the naval operation's sole purpose is to fight Latin American drug cartels operating in the Caribbean, particularly those involved in cocaine and fentanyl trafficking. Officials at the U.S. Department of Defense argue the region has become a crucial route for narco-trafficking, and that the military presence is meant to disrupt those routes and capture leaders of criminal organizations. Beyond the naval presence, another piece that's really ticked off the Venezuelan government is the ramp-up in reconnaissance flights by the U.S. military. According to the accusation made by Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the United States tripled the number of spy plane flights near Venezuela in August 2025. The aircraft used in these missions are mainly P-8 Poseidons, maritime patrol planes equipped with advanced surveillance systems, next-gen radars, and sensors capable of detecting movements on land, sea, and in the air at long distances. These planes fly over international waters, which is perfectly legal under international maritime law, but their constant presence is seen by Caracas as a form of espionage and prep for a possible military action. What worries Venezuelans most is the change in the pattern of these flights. Traditionally, reconnaissance ops were carried out during the day when visibility is better and flying conditions are safer. But starting in August, U.S. planes began flying missions at night, and in the early morning too, suggesting a more sophisticated intelligence operation and possibly prep for some future action. Venezuela answered these flights in a way the Pentagon saw as provocative. Venezuelan military aircraft, including Russian-made Sukhoi fighters, flew close to U.S. ships in international waters. The U.S. Department of Defense labeled those actions highly provocative and warned that interfering with counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism operations could have serious consequences. Not satisfied with just training civilians and talking tough about Washington, Nicolas Maduro's government decided to answer the U.S. presence in the Caribbean with its own show of military force. At the end of August 2025, the Venezuelan Navy announced it was mobilizing part of its fleet to carry out defensive naval drills in Caribbean waters under Venezuelan jurisdiction. Even though Venezuela doesn't have a navy anywhere near as powerful as America's, the mobilization served as a symbolic gesture that the country wouldn't sit still in the face of what it considers a threat. Patrol ships, frigates, and smaller vessels were moved to strategic points, and coastal defense exercises were carried out to show response capability. In September 2025, Venezuela kept running military drills in the Caribbean, including air defense simulations and blockade operations against possible maritime incursions. The Operational Strategic Command of the Venezuelan Armed Forces released footage of soldiers training, simulated anti-air missile launches, and naval maneuvers with a hypothetical scenario of defending against an amphibious invasion. These exercises were accompanied by an intense media campaign inside Venezuela. Maduro's government used all state communication channels to push messages of national unity, readiness to defend, and resistance against what it calls American imperialism. State TV programs, radio, and government-controlled social media were flooded with patriotic and militaristic content, aiming to build a general climate of mobilization. Things took an even more serious turn at the end of September, when Nicolas Maduro signed an emergency decree alleging an invasion threat from the United States. This kind of decree is a legal tool that lets the government take extraordinary measures in national emergency situations, suspending some constitutional guarantees and concentrating powers in the executive. The emergency decree signed by Maduro doesn't spell out exactly which measures will be taken, but historically this kind of instrument has been used to justify restrictions on press freedom, forced mobilization of economic resources, tighter population control, and even the possibility of mass compulsory military recruitment. The official justification presented by the Venezuelan government is that the U.S. military presence in the Caribbean represents a real and imminent threat to national security. Maduro argues Washington is laying the groundwork for a military intervention under the pretext of fighting drug traffickers and criminal groups. Under this view, the United States would be repeating a historical pattern of interventions in Latin America that were publicly justified for humanitarian or security reasons, but actually had geopolitical and economic aims. It's worth remembering that Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, which has always been a major factor in its international relations. Critics of the U.S. government argue that Washington's interest in the region isn't just about fighting narco-trafficking, but also about securing influence over strategic resources at a time of global geopolitical tensions. One of the most controversial elements in this whole scenario is the involvement of transnational criminal groups, particularly the Venezuelan gang known as the Tren de Aragua. This criminal organization, which started as a faction inside Venezuela's prison system, expanded its operations to several Latin American countries and even to the United States, getting involved in drug trafficking, extortion, kidnappings, and human trafficking. The Trump administration designated the Tren de Aragua a terrorist organization and directly accuses Nicolas Maduro's government of maintaining ties with this group. According to U.S. authorities, there's evidence that gang leaders operate freely in Venezuela, possibly with protection from sectors of the government, and use Venezuelan territory as a base for their international criminal activities. In September 2025, one specific incident cranked tensions up dramatically. U.S. military forces attacked a vessel in the Caribbean that was transporting a large amount of drugs. The clash left 11 people dead. Later, U.S. authorities identified the crew as members of the Tren de Aragua and repeated the claim that this gang is being controlled by the Venezuelan president. In a surprising twist, Nicolas Maduro himself offered to cooperate with the Trump administration to capture gang leaders operating in Venezuela. In public statements, Maduro said he's willing to work with Washington to fight organized crime, as long as the United States recognizes his legitimacy as president and stops what he calls military aggression. The proposal, however, was met with skepticism by U.S. officials who see Maduro as part of the problem, not the solution. To fully grasp what's happening now, it's important to look at the recent history of U.S.-Venezuela relations. Tensions didn't start yesterday. They're the result of decades of mutual distrust, ideological conflicts, and struggles for regional influence. Under Hugo Chavez, Maduro's predecessor, Venezuela took an explicitly anti-American stance, aligning with countries like Cuba, Russia, and China. Chavez nationalized strategic industries, including parts of the oil sector that were in foreign hands, and used oil revenue to fund social programs and strengthen alliances with left-wing governments in Latin America. After Chavez died in 2013, Nicolas Maduro took power and kept that political line, but he ran into a devastating economic crisis. Falling oil prices, poor economic management, and widespread corruption pushed Venezuela into one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent Latin American history. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating a refugee crisis that affected the whole region. The United States responded with harsh economic sanctions, freezing Venezuelan assets abroad and recognizing Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president in 2019, challenging Maduro's legitimacy. Those measures deepened Venezuela's international isolation and worsened the economic crisis, but they didn't trigger regime change as some in U.S. politics expected. As part of its strategy to show defense capability, the Venezuelan government announced in January 2025 the military drills called Bolivarian Shield 2025. These drills represent the largest joint mobilization of regular forces, militias, and civilians since Maduro took power. The drills were held on January 22nd and 23rd, 2025, just days after Donald Trump was sworn in for his second term as President of the United States. The date choice wasn't a coincidence. Maduro wanted to send a clear message that Venezuela was ready to defend its sovereignty no matter who was in the White House. Bolivarian Shield included simulations of various conflict scenarios, including defense against air attacks, repelling amphibious landings on coastal areas, counterintelligence operations, and popular mobilization for urban resistance. Not only professional soldiers took part, but also thousands of volunteer militiamen who make up the Bolivarian National Militia. Beyond conventional military drills, Bolivarian Shield had a major civil mobilization component. The public was encouraged to join civil defense activities like identifying threats, first aid in conflict situations, and community organization for resistance. That strategy reflects Venezuela's military doctrine of integral defense of the nation, which doesn't rely only on the regular armed forces, but on the entire population. Not everything about Venezuela's military mobilization has been voluntary and transparent. Reports from human rights organizations and independent media outlets have denounced cases of forced recruitment, particularly in remote parts of the country, like the mining areas in southern Venezuela. In August 2025, reports surfaced that the Venezuelan army began compulsory recruitment of men in artisanal and illegal mining zones, mostly in Bolívar state, where gold extraction fuels a massive informal economy. According to these reports, men of military age were taken from their communities and brought to barracks without prior notice or proper legal process. The Venezuelan government denied those accusations, saying the entire enlistment process is being carried out within the law and that there is no forced recruitment. Maduro said the public's response to the call to join the Bolivarian militia was massive and enthusiastic, with hundreds of thousands of volunteers showing up on their own. But accounts from relatives of those recruited and human rights activists paint a different picture. There are claims that many who went to the barracks did so out of fear of reprisals or because they were pressured by local authorities tied to the government. Some reports mention that public employees were told to enlist under threat of losing their jobs. What started as an American anti-drug operation in the Caribbean has turned into one of the biggest diplomatic and military crises between the United States and Venezuela in decades. Maduro's call for Venezuelan civilians to learn to shoot is an important symbolic milestone, showing that Caracas takes the U.S. threat very seriously, or at least wants its people to believe so. In the coming months, we'll likely see a continuation of this war of narratives and shows of force. The United States will keep a military presence in the Caribbean, carrying out anti-narcotics operations and possibly ramping up economic sanctions. Venezuela, in turn, will keep running military drills, using anti-imperialist rhetoric and trying to strengthen its ties with Russia and China. The biggest risk isn't necessarily a deliberate decision to go to armed conflict, but an accidental incident that could escalate quickly. A clash between military aircraft, a bad intelligence call, or a rash move by either side could trigger a retaliation spiral that nobody really wants but would be hard to control. For the Venezuelan population, already hit hard by years of economic and humanitarian crisis, the prospect of armed conflict is terrifying. Millions have already fled the country in search of better living conditions. A scenario of military confrontation could spark a new massive migration wave, making the regional humanitarian situation even worse. History teaches us that military tensions don't always lead to outright war, but when decisions are driven by national pride, domestic political pressures, and bad strategic calculations, the unthinkable can become reality. The situation between Venezuela and the United States is a reminder that we live in a world where peace can't be taken for granted, and where decisions made in Caracas and Washington can have consequences across the whole region. What's clear is that Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela is going all in on a strategy of popular mobilization and resistance, prepping its people for the worst-case scenario. Whether this is real prep for an imminent conflict or a political tactic to consolidate internal power and distract from the country's economic problems, only time will tell. And you, what do you think about this situation? Do you believe there's a real possibility of an armed clash between Venezuela and the United States? Drop your opinion in the comments. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to keep up with all our international politics analysis. See you in the next video.